There's so many things about God that I appreciate that I really couldn't begin to list them all, but one of the things I'm sure that's on the top of that list is that God judges us based on different criteria than other men do. When I think back to when I was in high school, for instance, when high school, I'm sure for most of you, is a place where we are all judged quite often by our peers. I was not one who was among the in crowd. I know it's hard to believe that, but it is true. I was not what they call one of the cool kids, okay? There's no way I ever would have been elected class president, yearbook editor, captain of the football team, a member of the football team, anything like that. I've often wondered if there is what they call an inverse relationship between a kid's level of popularity that they enjoy in school versus their success later in life. In other words, do those kids who are among the cream of the crop, to say, in their high school, are they successful or do they sort of fizzle out? It's a very complicated subject, that's for sure. All I can really say is from my perspective is that living a life in relative obscurity, I think, prepared me better for later in life. And I can see how it could be a shock to those kids who were the proverbial big fish in a small pond in high school once they step out into the real world. Now you're a fish in a much larger pond. Well, today we will be looking at the first king of Israel, King Saul, who we talked about 2 weeks ago. And I think of Saul as the popular kid in school. He was the guy that everybody wanted to be like. He's the exact kind of king that the people wanted. Based on his outward appearances, he was the guy. The Bible tells us a good bit about him. He was from a prominent family, he was tall, and he was handsome. Now one might say he would have been the prime candidate for class president, the guy everyone can rally around. It's interesting that God selected him as the first king as a punishment for the Israelites for rejecting God himself as king. And it's a very hard lesson for the Israelites to learn. It is a good thing, though, that any time when God makes us learn hard lessons, there comes a time when the punishment is now over and you move on. Well, Saul, we know, was just a mortal man. He would not live forever. So another person would have to take his place as king sooner or later. And if you paid attention in your Sunday school growing up through the years, you probably remember that David would become Saul's successor as Israel's second king. Now, in this country, we're used to going to the polls every year. Every 4 years, we get to vote for president like we did a year ago. And we do that in November. Now, it's about 2 months later. It's a pretty quick time, actually, a pretty quick transition period that the president takes power. Now, in between November and January, there is a date in December when the electors who are actually voted, a lot of people don't realize we're not actually voting for the man, we're voting for his or her electors. They get together in December, they meet, and they cast their ballots for the appropriate candidate. Now, it's not a civics class here, so I won't belabor that point, but we're used to the new person taking over in a relatively short period of time. This was not the case with King David. He was anointed by God as Israel's next king, while Saul, the first king, was still reigning in power. It wasn't until many years later, and much drama unfolds in the meantime, that David actually assumed that position of king. But before we get too far into that, let us first go to the Lord, the word of the Lord, and see how David was actually selected. And we see this in the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 16. And if you're following along in your Pew Bible, you'll find it on page 202. And we'll be reading the first 13 verses from 1 Samuel 16. And the word of the Lord says, the Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I am sending you Jesse of Bethlehem, to Jesse of Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king." But Samuel said, "How can I go? Saul will hear about it and kill me." The Lord said, "Take a heifer with you and say, 'I have come to sacrifice to the Lord.' Invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what to do. You are to anoint for me the one I indicate." Samuel did what the Lord said. When he arrived in Bethlehem, the elders of the town trembled when they met him. They asked, "Do you come in peace?" Samuel replied, "Yes, in peace. I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come to the sacrifice with me." Then he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. When they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab and thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things man looks at. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." Then Jesse called Abinadab and had him pass in front of Samuel. But Samuel said, "The Lord has not chosen this one either." Jesse then had Shammah pass by. But Samuel said, "Nor has the Lord chosen this one." Jesse had 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. But Samuel said to him, "The Lord has not chosen these." So he asked Jesse, "Are these all the sons you have?" "There is still the youngest," Jesse answered, "but he is tending the sheep." Samuel said, "Send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives." So he sent and had him brought in. He was ruddy, with a fine appearance and handsome features. Then the Lord said, "Rise and anoint him. He is the one." So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came upon David in power. Samuel then went to Ramah. The Lord's blessing be added to the reading and to the hearing of his holy word. I'm sure I've said this before somewhere along the way, but David is probably my personal favorite character in the Bible, other than, of course, Jesus himself. Because when you look at David, you can see how he is in many ways just like us. David does really good things on some days, and on other days he does really, really bad things too. And if you're like me and not a member of that in crowd, then I think you can also relate to David in this passage. Start with verse 7 first. If you're one who's really good at memorizing Scripture, this is a good one I would suggest committing to memory, where Jesus or God says, "Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him." The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Isn't that a good verse? This verse alone should give us inspiration that if we look at our life, and if we see that we're the one who's picked last for kickball on the playground, or turned down for a promotion at work, or turned down for a credit card, or if you go to the store to take advantage of that sale that you just saw yesterday, and you learn that it ended yesterday, and now you got to pay the higher price, then I think you can appreciate David. People get turned down for all sorts of reasons. Too old, too young, too tall, too short, too fat, too thin, whatever the case is. People always will find a reason to reject other people, whether it's fair or not. But the good news is, God is not like that. God looks for a reason to accept you. God was referring to King Saul when he said, people look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Saul was the people's choice for king, but now God was making his choice. And remember, from earlier in this chapter, Saul was very impatient, very impulsive, and he showed a lack of trust in God on several occasions. So God says, the Lord has sought for himself a man after his own heart. That man would be David. And to put it in perspective, this is really the very beginning for David. We haven't read about Goliath yet. David had not won any military conquest yet. And also David wasn't appearing at Bathsheba yet either. The very beginning for him. And if you are one of those who reads the Bible from cover to cover in a year, or if you've ever read it from cover to cover, the very first time when you come across David here, you don't even realize how short and small of a man he is. And that's why God gives us a stark contrast between the small David and the large Saul. Again, for those of us not familiar with that in crowd, maybe you can identify with David. Where at this point, David, he was a nobody. As a matter of fact, up to this point, we have not even read his name yet in the Bible. It's not until Samuel actually anoints him as king that we learn his name. And even his own father, Jesse, doesn't call him by his name. He just says, the youngest. The youngest is out with the sheep. Well, that's got to make you feel good as David, doesn't it? I mean, your own father doesn't even refer to you by your own name. So I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. Now, this is a situation where Samuel comes to the people in peace, and he invites the family of Jesse to attend a sacrifice. Well, that sounds like fun, doesn't it? I mean, what are we going to do on a Saturday night? Go to a movie? Been there. Go to the mall? Done that. Go to a ball game? Not interested. Watch a priest kill a cow? Oh, that sounds interesting. Let's do that. It was a different time and a different place, is all that I can say about that. But what was typically involved in a sacrifice was there was a large meal. And when we read this, is David initially invited to this meal? No. In verse 11, where Jesse refers to David as the youngest, we read he's in the field tending the sheep. And in other words, his own father doesn't even invite him to a very significant banquet. Now, let's not let his brothers off the hook here too. There were 7 of them, we read. Any of them could have spoken up before this point and said, oh, hey, before we do this, before we pass in front of Samuel, what about little David? No one said that. However, I don't want to be too hard on his brothers, because when I was younger, honestly, I wouldn't have been very concerned if either of my sisters were at the dinner table one time either. I figured you snooze, you lose, okay? It's a cutthroat world out there, especially around the dinner table. But, once again, where men overlook others, God does the exact opposite. And in a world where we are so used to evil triumphing over good, it's quite a relief to read Samuel's words when he says, send for him, we will not sit down until he arrives. Now, what I'm going to say may sound a little odd, but this actually reminds me of Cinderella. If you can stay with me on this, in the original cartoon movie, the king at the end sends the duke around to all the homes in the town trying to find the girl that fits the glass slipper. And of course, in typical Disney fashion, it's not until the Duke reaches the last person in the last house. But the shoe doesn't fit either of the ugly stepsisters, does it? So he asks the stepmother if anyone is left in the house. She, of course, lies and says, no, there's no one else here, not knowing that the little mice were up in the attic helping Cinderella out of the locked attic. All of a sudden, you see Cinderella bounding down the steps, and the stepmother makes one more feeble attempt to keep Cinderella away from the Duke and the slipper. But the Duke, who's very tired now from being up in this search all night long, tells her sharply, the king's orders are to try the slipper on every maiden. That's what's going on here. Samuel has directions from God to have every son of Jesse pass in front of Samuel. Samuel is not to begin until every son is present, no matter how long it takes. And you know why? Because just like Cinderella, it's the king's orders. Just as Cinderella was the unlikely maiden to fit the glass slipper, David was the unlikely son to be anointed king. He was the youngest and the smallest. Where we read 3 positive descriptions of Saul, he was from the prominent family, he was tall and he was handsome, we only read 1 positive description of David, and that's that he is sort of good looking. On paper, David's not nearly as impressive as Saul. David, we read, was tending the sheep in the field when this happened. And that tells us that since they had their youngest son tend the sheep, they obviously couldn't afford a servant. More prominent families could do that. Well, David got stuck with that job. And it's sort of like grasping for straws to find something positive to say about David. Hey, he's not tall, he's not this, he's not that, but he's sort of good looking anyway. That's really all we can say about an otherwise unimpressive young boy. Do any of us relate to David now? As we move on from David, I want to offer a few words about David's brothers. Maybe we have also felt like his brothers at one time or another in our lives when we were the ones who were being passed by. Now, were they passed by because they were bad men? The Bible doesn't tell us that. Not necessarily bad men. The Bible doesn't tell us there was any defect whatsoever in them that led them to not being selected. And that's how it is for all of us at one time or another. It's just that sometimes God has a different plan for different people. Let me put it this way. Since Christians are God's elect, that's the verbiage that we read in the New Testament, God is not what we call an equal opportunity elector. He elects some people for job A, some people for job B, and others for job C. Not everyone can do the same thing. Not everyone can be the pastor. And it would not work out well if we had 50 pastors here all trying to do the same thing at the same time. Because at this time and this place, God has appointed me to this position. It doesn't mean that I'm any better than you. It's just that God has chosen to give me a unique job. He has given you unique jobs that I am not qualified for. But the good news is that since we each have this unique job, we know that God cares enough about us to put us in positions to support the church in a variety of ways. Some people are very good and able to support the church financially and keep it running. Others are able to come in and devote their time to cleaning the church. Some people are able to give a month of their time to be an usher or a greeter. And although we are all called to pray, God has put some special individuals in positions where they are able to devote hours of a day in prayer. And that's very important. It reminds me of something that Billy Graham once said. He said through his life, he has gotten a lot of letters, especially from elderly people who wish they could do more for their church and be involved, but due to a variety of reasons, they can't get around and they can't do these kind of things that they want to do. They say, all I can do is pray. Billy, what should I do? And Billy answers them, do whatever you have Billy doesn't tell them, do whatever you have to do to get out there because they need you out there. He doesn't say that. He says, if all you can do is pray, thank you for doing the most important thing. So going back to David's brothers now, no, they weren't necessarily bad men. They simply weren't called to be the second king of Israel. It was not God's will for their life. And this leads to our last point, which again, what was David doing whenever Samuel was searching for him to anoint him as king? He was doing the same job in the same way he has done every day before, which is tending sheep. That is, I think, the big lesson this morning. Keep doing what you're doing. You may never be chosen king and selected for a glamorous position and a glamorous title, but even David was being faithful in the exact place where God put him. He was overlooked by man in that position, but he was not overlooked by God. Christians should always be waiting to be used by God. So here's sort of the phrase of the morning. Make your waiting time your training time. It's no different than working yourself up the corporate ladder. It's possible for a person to start out in the mailroom, and then you get promoted to a clerk position. Then maybe you're promoted to supervisor, and maybe you could even, in this country, be promoted to president of that company. And you started out in the mailroom. When that happens, it's typically only possible when you have given your best effort at every position on that ladder. Aside from nepotism, no one is expected to be promoted when they're lazy. You would be stuck in your minimum wage job, eventually hate your job that you have to go to every single day, know you're going nowhere because you didn't put forth the effort when you had the opportunity. In the same way, God put you in where you are for a reason. And He's constantly evaluating your performance. If you're growing, then maybe He will give you more responsibility. But on the other hand, if you're just going through the motions and not making the most of your situation, then God has no interest whatsoever in promoting you. You may be stuck in a position that's very dull and boring, and there doesn't seem to be a way out. I can't tell you why God put you in that position, but I can tell you that God did it for a reason. He is not a chaotic God. God has specifically ordered certain things for certain reasons that we oftentimes may never know. But the important thing is that God knows why He has done that, and that's the important thing, that He knows He has a purpose for you. Where Saul didn't trust God and acted impulsively, the other week we talked about when he offered up the sacrifice before waiting for Samuel, David trusted God. And we see that in the way that he diligently went to work day after day, doing the duty that God gave him and bringing honor and glory to His name. Because David was faithful, he was then ready whenever God shows him. For me, 1 Samuel 16 is an extremely inspirational chapter of the Bible, and I hope it is for you too. Look at that last verse. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. That same powerful Spirit is available to all of us when we are faithful in doing what God has called us to do in the place He's called us to do it. God doesn't look for faithful followers just because they're in the in crowd. He looks for anyone who is willing to submit to His authority, regardless of who they rub elbows with. Aren't you glad that in verse 7 of 1 Samuel 16, it says, the Lord does not look at the things that people look at. People look at outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Let us now go to Him in prayer.